I'd like to thank everybody for zooming in this evening for this discussion of The Last Resort, a novel by Kay Tobler Liss. And I just would like to read from the back the little mini bio that's in there. This is from the last page of the book. Kay Tobler Liss is a writer and editor, having worked for newspapers and magazines in New York and Maine for many decades. Among the magazines she worked for were Sunstorm Arts, House and Hamptons magazine, and the managing editor of the Shelter Island Reporter. She studied literature at Bard College and environmental studies at Southampton College, and has taught courses in both fields in New York and Maine. She has won a prize for her poetry at 17 years old and was published in the Smith College Literary Magazine. She lived in Montauk, New York for 13 years and now lives in Maine. This is her first novel, and I'd like to introduce Kay Tobler Liss.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Stephen, for hosting this. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Some of you I know, or probably most of you, but some I don't. So welcome and thank you.
I'd like to start. I'll just ask, what was what inspired you to write this novel, this first novel?
Well, I suppose I should say that what inspired me is my lifelong passion for what it means to be connected to the natural world for myself and for everyone, for human beings. So ever since I was very young, I've thought about this a lot. And then the other passion that developed sort of early on was for the history and the plight of Native Americans. So I read quite a bit about Native Americans living out from the West, but later on I read more about East Coast Native Americans. And then when I was living in Montauk, the two themes really came together perfectly, because I was living on land that once belonged to the Montaukett Indians, Montaukett Native Americans. So I steeped myself in the history of the tribe and what happened to them. And where I lived, it was just so beautiful. Many acres of trees and lakes, and we were right near the ocean. So nature was a really very primal force there. So that's how those two themes came together. And then as an environmentalist all my life, I've always been very active in and concerned about preserving land. And not that there was a definite threat to this piece of property that I loved, but it was sort of something out there, sort of a possibility. So I created this story out of this possible threat to development. And that's the last resort is the result.
Well, I have a few other questions. There's a very emphasis on um, Paul Collins keeping a journal, and he writes in his journal regularly um, what's happening to him. And I don't think this would give away anything, but there's a definite change in both Paul um, and in the person that he's learning from, who he's come out to help. Um, he also there's the role of dreams in the novel also plays an important part, because Paul has a number of dreams, and
Yes.
it's referred to as a very important aspect in the Native American culture as dreams. And was this something that was researched along the way, or did you?
Um, well, I think just because of all my reading about Native Americans all my life, I did understand that the dream world was very important to them. And it's important to me. And I felt that through having the dreams, it's not just a typical narrative, it's a linear narrative. You have these dreams that tell you things that are, you know, outside of your normal experience. And I think it adds a dimension to the novel. And it's just something that I'm really interested in, my dreams, people's dreams. And so, yeah.
I also found interesting that Paul was involved in philosophy classes when he was in college,
Mm-hmm.
and he mentions quite a number of philosophers throughout the novel, Nietzsche,
Right.
and it's interesting how Bertram Bertram is named for Bertrand Russell,
Mm-hmm.
um, but he's actually um, that's one of the things that's actually brought up is how he doesn't use his Native American name. He changed it to Bertram so that he can kind of fit in. And
No, actually, his parents named him that,
yeah,
and
because
they were very interested in not identifying with their Native American roots. And it was only when he was older that he became more interested, and he sort of rebelled against the idea of, you know, not being Native American or part Native American. So he thought about changing his name because Bertrand is such a sort of Anglo name. But then he started to read Bertrand Russell and really liked him, so he decided to keep the name.
can you elaborate on what surfing plays in the novel? How important surfing is? There's a big
Mhm.
thing happens in the novel during a
Right.
surfing meet.
Well, surfing is really important because he's in Montauk and people do learn how to surf there, and the ocean is great. But it's also, sorry, my phone is going off. Hide it. Um, it's a very important element in the book because he's living on the ocean, and I didn't really consciously plan this, but I thought about it in some sort of vague way, that I wanted the four elements of nature to be in there. So I have water, fire, air, and earth. And the ocean, the water is really important. And the surfing is something that I actually took some surfing lessons when I lived in Montauk, and I really loved it. My son was quite a really good surfer. So he read some the chapters when I did them, the first draft, to make sure I got some of the technical aspects right, because I never learned how to surf enough to be really good, but I knew the basics. And it's important to Paul because he's immersing himself in this world, and it's symbolic of that. He feels you know, so great when he's out there in the ocean. And then I think one of the really pivotal parts of the book is when he almost drowns,
Mm.
because he has this epiphany about how the world is really all there. I think I have the beauty of nature is there and we don't see it. I think I have a quote from St. Thomas from the Bible, who said that the the kingdom of God is spread upon the earth, but man does not see it. And that comes to him after the near drowning experience. So it is really important. The surfing is really important. Plus he gets to meet Bertrand, and then not Bertrand, the
The
other,
captain,
Brent.
who,
Brent is
and
the surfer.
yeah,
Sometimes I get Bertrand,
and
Brent the surfer.
I had when Bertram comes into play, I believe at that point he meets Bertram when he's driving back from Riverhead and he's going through Wainscott, and I
Right.
could picture him stopping at like a kind of a Barry's boot camp or one of the places left of the Wainscott post office because it's very descriptive. I mean, anyone who's out east can just picture a lot of the places. And also, you mentioned I like how he refers to going west of Montauk as Up Island because
Mm-hmm.
we hear that constantly. I'm going up island, but
Right.
also the fishermen, the commercial fishermen. There's a little bit of history of what the baymen were going through over the years with
Mm-hmm.
the nets, and they're
Yes.
kind of almost throwing a little bit of that into also what the Native Americans experienced over the
Exactly.
changes. And I think that, you know, crossing the two together um, does work very well. And I know, just as discussed earlier in the novel, where you have all the Montauks, and just the aunt is the only one who's full-blooded Montauk that is left around. Everyone else is a percentage, or they're
Right.
married to a Shinnecock Indian, or they're married to a Caucasian. So you could see how this culture that was there, like thriving at one time, is now just, you know, thinning out. And the same thing is happening with the Baymen and
With
all
yeah.
of different
Right.
things. And you know, in the part where Paul goes to Riverhead, there's a few there's more. There's a lot of big box stores now in Riverhead.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I could have just imagined remembering it when I was a kid, and then seeing, you know, now all the big box stores, and really the only, you know, rural spaces you have on Long Island is really along the North Fork. You
Right.
know, on the Sound Avenue, that's been um, sort of immune from big box stores for quite some time. But I could definitely see the changes as it's being discussed in here.
Right, and I liked the scene in the end at the town hall in East Hampton, your town, um, where the bayman, Captain Lester, completely understands the plight of the Native Americans, because they were trying to do their type of fishing, hull seining, and it was outlawed. And of course, Peter Matheson wrote a wonderful book, Men's
Men's
Lives,
lives. Yep.
all about that. And I think his sympathy also with having their sort of livelihood, their territory taken away too, because some of their fishing lands are privatized, and it's it's a cultural identity or sympathy they have for each other. And then going back 300 years, Captain Lester said, the Montauks showed the early settlers some of their best places to fish. And that's not something that people normally do. Um, so I think, there's this perception that there was not any kind of coordination or friendliness between natives and settlers. And there was some, but of course, most of it was oppression and pushing the natives off their land, displacing them. And it's still going on. And it's amazing. When I was down in Montauk the first weekend of August to do some readings, on the front page of the East Hampton Star, there was a story about a state legislator Fred Thiel, introducing legislation into Albany, into the state legislature, to declare, have the Montauks declared as a tribe. After all these years, they're still trying to become a legitimate tribe, which would give them rights to, make certain claims. The Shinnecocks in Southampton, on the other hand, they are a tribe, so they have a reservation and they have ways of, you know, being able to assert their rights in certain ways. And they're in the news too. Just last week, there was something in the Star about the Shinnecocks, a moratorium being declared on this sacred land to them was burial ground. So it's very much out there. And I just feel this is a time with the racial injustice issues going on that is, of course, most of the focus is on African Americans, but Native Americans are in that discussion too, but not enough, I believe. So I really think it's an important time for this story to get out there. Not just my story, I mean the story of Native Americans and their issues. Standing Rock has been in the news for a long time out in North Dakota, South Dakota, how they're trying to, assert their rights on land that big multinational oil companies want to drill on, and it just goes on and that's part of my story is that we have to speak out for the rights of the land, not just people, but we should have land and trees, and creatures should have rights, and they do under certain laws, thank goodness. But they're always being threatened and loosened, especially now. And I think we really have to pay attention to what's going on. So
I like how too you touch a little bit on the bubonic accent of the bubonicers, which is another thing that's kind of that's thinning out. And I, I I think about that because we have at the library, there were tape recordings that were made many years ago, either on reel-to-reel or cassette, with many of the different fishermen, the daymen, the wives, and these recordings were made in the early 70s, I guess up to as far as maybe the early 80s. And we've been digitizing them to make them available to the public so they can hear about, the fishing industry and history. And some of them, their families date back centuries. And, one of the recordings, the man who was being interviewed was in his 80s and remembered the 1890s, and it's a great capsule into history that these tapes are still available, and now they're being preserved digitally, but we get to hear the way the accent was and the flavor of the time. And that's, it's great that that's mentioned in that section of the novel. But in all, I thought it was a great read. An individual can learn a lot about Montauk, its history, and also, you get a nice non-violent, non-threatening story. And I think that, it might even work possibly as like a little play at some point.
yeah, I've thought about that. I've thought about a film and that kind of thing. So yeah.
Well, what I'd like to do is I'd like to open the floor for questions. If anyone has any questions for Kay, feel free to type a question in the chat, or if you'd like to use the raise hand feature, or unmute your mic, I'll be glad to acknowledge it. We'll be glad to ask that question. I do have to say we have a copy of the novel. This will be a second copy, but we do have a copy at the East Hampton Library for circulation,
Great.
um, for people to read. We actually have it in our new book section,
Thank
so
you.
we'll be glad to keep that there, and perhaps we can even place one into the fiction section in our local history room, because there are a lot of um, good points in there. And I like how John Strong is mentioned in one part, because he was very big with writing about the area's history.
Right.
He even, his writings are, some of his writings are included in one of our Discovering the Path um, books that the library put out. It was a 5-volume set of the history of Long Island, dating back to its origins up until probably the late 1970s, early 1980s, with the writings of Jeanette Edwards Rattray. But John Strong's writings are included in there, which is why, it comes in handy for someone who's learning about the area.
Yeah. So I think Kay Campbell had from Celine. Okay. Kay, how did you decide to make a male your lead character, and did you find that challenging? Should I read that? Can everyone see the question, or is everyone able to see the question?
No, I could read it.
Okay, I'll read it louder. I didn't read it loud enough. Could we put it up again?
Sure.
And Kay had one before that, Kay Campbell, but we'll go to this one first. Should I click on the chat?
Celine asks, Kay, how did you decide to make a male your lead character, and did you find that challenging?
No, I didn't find it too challenging. Actually, before I wrote this book, and I might have told you this before, Celine, I wrote a book about my dad, based on my father, a story, and I found that really hard because he was still around, and it was hard to be objective. But I've always felt that I could understand the perspective of a man. I don't know why I thought this, but I think I can. And so this book is sort of it's not, there are some threads of that first novel about my father in this. It's not definitely about him, but I just feel that I can understand a man's point of view. Now, I'm not sure a man reading that. I'll have to ask Rob Rollinger what he thinks. But I think I can understand. I grew up with 2 brothers too. Maybe that helps.
We had a question from.
Well, if you're gonna ask Rob Reilinger, I'll answer. I think he's really believable. He's a sensitive man.
Yeah.
Very sensitive, and for a lawyer, my God, I know some lawyers. He's exceptional, but he's beautiful and he's learning, and I think you absolutely capture him.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that's the idea. He's struggling to get away from that corporate world, a linear thinking world, and by immersing himself in nature, he's able to loosen up and maybe write a few lines of poetry. And plus the fact that I do say right from the beginning that he actually thought about being an Episcopal priest, and his father wanted him to be a lawyer because he was a judge, and his mother wanted him to be a writer. So he had these things in his background. Plus, he was a philosophy major in college, and that made him thoughtful. So I think, he's complicated, but he's trying to get away from that structured, restricted thinking that he felt he was in.
Absolutely captured it perfectly, Kay.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate that.
We had another question from Kay Campbell. Kay, who is your favorite character in the book and why?
Well, it should be Paul, right? He's the main character. But I really like Bertrand. And, he's complicated. He's an artist. He is, very, very passionate. He is one of my favorite characters. He's very, animated, and very sort of wants to be part of the sort of white world, but then feels this very strong identity with his native roots. And I think he struggles a lot with trying to balance his life in the city and life out in Montauk. I like him a lot. I also like his grandmother, Aunt Olivia. She reminds me a little bit of just a wise elder. My grandmother was like that, and probably many of us have grandmothers who had wisdom, and so I like her a lot. I can't say which is my favorite. Those are two of my favorite.
Could you see the novel being adapted to a like a Netflix film, or perhaps a series spinning off?
I don't know about a series. You mean something beyond what the novel talks about? A sequel kind of thing?
Well, it would be like Paul in Montauk, working with the Montauks, the remaining individuals, and using his legal expertise to help. You know,
Mm-hmm. I could see that. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, I've thought about if it were a film, who would play Paul? Leonardo DiCaprio. It came to the top of me. So I think it would make a good film, but the challenge would be there's a lot of inner dialogue, and of course it's written from the first person, but a lot of films are doing really good things with inner dialogue and a narrator who's just narrating in the background. So I don't know. I would be interesting.
well, does anyone have any questions? Any further questions for Kay?
Well, okay. How
Yep.
much of the plot, don't tell me too much, because I'm only 3/4 of the way through. How
Okay.
much of it is based on actual events?
Okay. Well, you mean the story of the environmental story, or
Yeah,
the whole?
no, yeah. The environmental story and the story of gaining recognition for the land as part
Mhm.
of the tribe.
Well, that is an ongoing story. As I said before, the Montauks are still trying to be declared a real tribe, and there are legislators working on that. So that's ongoing, and since 1879, no, it's 1907 when a judge declared they did not exist. They were standing there in his courtroom, and he said they don't exist. And actually, John Strong, Stephen, you brought up John Strong, who's an anthropologist, and he wrote a book called We're Still Here. And it was about how the Montauks really are still there. But the problem was that they're way back 100 years ago, you had to have a certain amount of blood that was deemed that is Montauk blood, not Shinnecock blood, not white blood, not black blood. And so, you know, a lot of the Montauks mixed with other people, black people, white people, and Shinnecocks, because there weren't that many around. They were pushed off their land, and many of them moved to the Midwest, upstate New York. So it was a very, very small group of people, and they intermarried. So that is very real, and that's a very real part of the story. Now, the environmental story, as I said, it's sort of loosely based on an actual threat that was sort of floating out there, about developing the land, not into a golf course, as I have in the book, but into something. And the land was actually saved back in the 1970s by a group of people who got together, the concerned citizens of Montauk, and Celine knows this story very well, because it was threatened with condominium development, and people got together and said, no, we don't want this to happen. And Suffolk County purchased the land and preserved it as a park. So, you know, that is definitely in the background, but it's fiction where I make up the kind of threat that's happening.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Kay.
We have a question from Celine. Kay, are you working on a new novel or something, some other form of writing?
Yes, I've been working on a second novel for a little while, and I see it as a sort of the next stage or the next phase of from this novel of our connection to nature. And it is not just one individual's transformation through reconnecting to the natural world, but it is sort of a family, a community. And it's a family that shares experiences from their childhood that were really, really special places that meant a lot to them. And by sharing these experiences, they come to certain understandings about their own lives and brings them closer together.
And is this going to be something that's coming out in the coming year, or?
I don't know. You know, it's such a hard time right now with the book coming out, and I'm just hoping that maybe in a few months down the way that I can actually get out and do some things with the book and go to places. And I have places I'd like to go and do readings and book talks. So I'm just kind of on hold with what's going to happen with the next one. So, but I do try to get back to it and keep writing. I'm so immersed in this though every day, 24/7, because I'm my own publicist pretty much. So I'm always thinking, what can I do and who can I write to help get the book out there.
The whole world is on hold, Kay. Don't
I know.
feel bad.
No, I know.
You know, what we've been trying to do is we've been trying to, well, I've been trying to estimate when we'd be able to get back to our in-house talks at the podium, and I'm hoping soonest, like January, right after New Year's.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we're able to do that, that would be great.
Yeah. I think there was a question from my friend Memory. Did you see it?
How much is your observation a personal one based on the years lived in Montauk?
how much is of the book is based on my years in Montauk?
Mhm.
Well, I would say a lot of it, but of course the philosophical sections are, um, from back when I was studying philosophy, and the philosophers that I was most interested in are in here, Heidegger and Nietzsche and Bertrand Russell, and then Thomas Berry, who is sort of an eco-philosopher, died, I think, in the mid 90s or late 90s. I didn't read his book, The Dream of the Earth, until the 1980s when it came out. And it's just been one of my very, very favorite books ever since then. I just love it. He gave so much to the world, and he was way ahead of his time. And imagine then, back in the 80s, he said, we're living in the ecological age. He saw that time as the sort of burgeoning of a new awareness about our connection to nature. And I think, a lot of things were going on that were very positive then. We had some new environmental laws, and people seemed to be engaged in those ideas. And then we fell asleep, I guess you could say. And the ideas of the money, the economy, and just the sort of the self-centeredness that people can show, and disregard for other life, just sort of took the forefront. And here we are. I think we're at an apex. We're at this great sort of clashing point. I think similar to the late 60s, it feels to me, where these forces are just colliding. And now, environmentally, I think it's obviously even more serious, because the planet is really suffering. And we really need to act. Back in the 60s, we needed to act because the water was dirty, the air was dirty, and we did some really good things. So that's why I am positive that we are going to make some good changes, because we did back then, and things were pretty desperate. Things felt apocalyptic then, and they do now for sure. But I think we're going to turn that corner.
I was also thinking of not just the environmental issues, but there's a point in the book where the environmental impact statement is brought up, and anytime there's been, of course, big buildings and construction before it begins. I mean, I've had a few environmental impact impact pieces of writing, evaluations that I've held on file, because usually what happens is a town will put it into a binding and have like a repository hold it for a time, like for a couple of years. So we've had a few at the library over the years, and it's interesting, everything that has to be gone through and tested before these things are done. And most of the time, they're done according to the rules. But it's sad when you see like a beautiful piece of land just that destroyed, that could have provided for people, whether it be like through farming or through whatever plants that might be growing there. And it's a shame. You see the birds go away, and everything becomes more like an urban, like New York City.
Right.
And I just, that's how I see the way things have changed in Riverhead, because 30, 40 years ago it was still pretty rural. A lot of older buildings still standing, and now you have one big store on one side of the street and another set of big stores on the other side. And
Yeah.
it's like they're competing with each other on either side. But you know, this is reminiscent of a time when things were simpler, and it I think it does a good job, the novel, conveying those thoughts. And I do look forward to another work, whether it be a sequel to this book or a different novel, um, in future.
Thank you. I think there was a question, another one from memory. The,
Is there hope on your part that there's an active result that comes from reading the book?
activist results. Yes. Yes, I do. That would be great. But, you know, it's a matter of it having to have a life beyond, you know, this little Zoom room, and or maybe not. Maybe just, you know, people here will be a part of something. I really do hope that it can get out there more. I thought about sending a copy to, what is her name? Greta, the little Swedish girl who's so in the
Greta
forefront.
Thunberg?
Yeah. And people, I just think it would be great if people would become more aware of their connection to nature. And I do think this is a time during these COVID times, people are getting out more into nature because they can't do the normal things that they have been doing, going to museums and going out to eat as much, or going, you know, to movies. So they're going out into nature, they're going on hikes, gardening more. So I do think that if they weren't aware of their connection so much before, maybe they are becoming more so now. So there's, even in these times, maybe something good will come out of it. Because after all, this virus it is an environmental disaster. We, you know, it was created from cutting down too many trees, letting species intermix too much, and then the markets, where I guess we're not really sure if that's where it came from, but there's more intermingling of species out in the wilds and the rainforests or wherever they're cutting a lot of trees, so that these zoonotic, I think there's zoonotic diseases are happening more. And so this is not the first that's going to happen. If this COVID-19, there are going to be others if we don't stop. So I do think it's there. We have to realize that this pandemic is part of our environmental disaster that's happening in the world.
Yeah, and hopefully it works itself out. Celine asks, will this discussion be posted on the library website and shareable? This has been a terrific presentation. I'd like to share the recording of the event if possible. Yes, indeed. We do post our author events on the YouTube page. If we get permission from the author, we gladly put it on YouTube. We
Yeah.
have someone who is very good with some of the editing devices and puts very nice titles at the beginning and puts end credits at the end with the title, author, the ISBN, the name of the publisher. This way people who see the video can search for the book and acquire a copy of it.
Oh, great. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, it usually takes about a week for the videos to get processed, because we have quite a few. We have a lot of children's programs and concerts and events for young adults. So the gentleman that does that is kind of editing all of them. So but we do get them up there as fast as possible, and they're able to be shared with everybody. What I do is I could, as soon as it gets up there, I could email you the link directly, and you'll be able to see it.
Great.
Let's see, we have. Are we allowed to un? Are we allowed to unmute to make comments? Sure, sure. By all means. I'll.
I'd love to hear Memory's voice.
Hi, Kay.
Hi, Memory.
There are many parts to this book, and there are many topical parts right now, as you mentioned, in relation to our place in nature. We're looking at West Coast fires and southern floods. But there's another part which has to do directly with Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter.
Right.
And I wonder if you can comment on the ways in which your book certainly addresses the lack of power or the powerlessness that is not assigned to people of color, and the way in which it's possible to claim it, which I think is part of the topic of your book, the narrative.
Right. Yes. I did talk a little bit about that. So I feel that it is a really it is an important theme. It's the second most important theme of the book, next to our need to pay attention to what's happening to the natural world. It's the oppressed people, the people who don't have a voice, as you say. And I feel that Native Americans have not had as much of a voice as even African Americans. Their history is, of course, really different, but it is tragic too. And we have never, as a country, come to an honest confrontation with that history. I mean, we're trying to do that right now with our history of slavery, our history with the African Americans. But Native Americans, it's not really out there that much. We really, I mean, just think there were at least, I think it's estimated, a couple of million Native Americans living on this continent when white people came. And they were reduced to something like less than a third within less than 100 years through, of course, killing and smallpox diseases, starving them, pushing them off their lands. So it is really, to me, it's our original sin as a country, and we have not really ever faced it. And I feel that this is a time where we have to face these things about our history. What's wrong with facing them and saying, I'm sorry, look what South Africa did. They had a reconciliation program, and there was forgiveness, and they went on. And I just feel that there's something so deep in our history that we have to face one way or another, hopefully non-violently. Does that answer your question enough, huh?
Would there be reparations? And what's your feeling on reparations, which is a major question at the moment? Very, very highly charged, very political. There are considerations for reparations for African Americans. The discussion hasn't extended so vociferously to Native Americans.
Right. Well, there are settlements, there are settlements for land. I mean, right here in Maine, the Penobscots, when was that, back in the 80s, got a lot of money for land, but reparations for other things, other indignities. I don't know, I don't know about reparations in terms of monetary rewards, other than certainly giving them their land, or you know, an equivalent monetary reward for the land that was taken from them in terms of their their you know, their villages and that kind of thing. I mean, you can't give them back the whole country, because they did live in just about every state of this country. So I do think, I don't know about rewards for, you know, other things. I'd have to really look into that. Is that what you're suggesting, like for?
There has been the suggestion that one way to do it is through scholarships and through reparations, through education.
Yeah.
So that's one way. It's a
Yeah.
very complicated question, but it comes up. It comes up as a result of reading your book.
Right, right. Yeah, I do think, I think it would be important to allow Native Americans to have more of a standing in our society when they're just shunted off to these reservations, and that's good because they have land, but then they're just so isolated, and they're just very sad places. I've visited some, and generally there's just such a lack of self-esteem, and so somehow it's very complicated, because unlike African Americans, many of them do live separately in these reservations. So it's really complicated. I think a commission could be appointed or started, and they could discuss ideas for sure.
Well, I thank you for being able to discuss this excellent novel with us this evening. And I also thank everyone for zooming in and being part of the discussion. And I wish you all the best with your novel and
Thank you.
promotions.
Thank you.
And look forward to another piece of writing.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Stephen. And
You're
thank
welcome.
you, everybody, for tuning in. And see you soon, I hope.
Have a great
Thanks,
evening.
Kay. Bye.
Bye.